We've already spent some time talking about network services in Unix and Linux, but it's of equal importance, possibly of more importance, that we also talk about network security. Now, network security is not such a thing that you can press a button or edit one configuration file and set security equals yes on your box. It's actually a function of many different elements in Unix and Linux and outside the box as well. There's several different elements that have to be configured and managed in certain combinations to provide tight network security, because if you don't configure these properly, you can allow a wide open system to exist where just about anyone can come in from the network and hit your box. Now, there's several things we'll talk about, but configuration files are among these things that we can use to manage these elements and their configurations. Some of the elements that we'll talk about with network security, and you'll find this throughout network security, not on just Unix or Linux, but throughout Windows, throughout networks. Some of these elements are there that specifically can control what kinds of things your box does, such as what services it allows and runs, and how these elements can be configured to disallow services or disallow access to services if you like. Ports, protocols, services, host names, IP addresses, usernames, and encryption methods are among the traditional host-based elements that can be controlled through configuration files and programs and so forth. Now, when we're talking about network security for our purposes during this session, we're talking about things that you can change and configure on the host itself. This is irregardless of things that happen on the network. Perhaps you have a network firewall or other network security devices. Well, that's great, but there are things on the host you can control as well to prevent malicious access to a host or unauthorized access, depending upon which ports you have open or closed, which protocols you're using, which services are running, also who you might allow to access the host from the network by host name or IP address or username, and whether you're using encryption protocols or not. All these things can affect network security. Now, some of the methods we'll discuss, both now and in later sessions in the course, include firewalls, setting those up, using encryption protocols, and configuring these files in a secure manner. Some of the relevant security configuration files that we'll talk about include etc inetd.conf. Now, we've talked about this before, as a matter of fact. Basically, this service allows you to restrict access to certain services that are running. First of all, you can allow only certain services and then allow only certain host names and IP addresses to access those services. And that uses TCP wrappers. Now, TCP wrappers we'll talk about in the next session, and it basically directly relates to host.allow and, if needed, host.deny files on your computers. These files in particular restrict who has access to these services and to your machine, and TCP wrappers and inetd aren't the only services that use host.allow. Now, host.deny, let me bring that up real quick. It's basically been deprecated. You'll find it in older implementations of Unix and Linux, but we don't use it so much anymore because now everything is done through the etc host.allow file. Now, secure shell, which we'll talk about again later on in another session, the two configuration files that we see a lot are sshd.config and ssh.config, and they allow you to configure both the daemon, the server daemon, and the client on a box to make sure that your secure shell connections are pretty secure. etcrc.conf is another file, and basically that file is where you configure things like the firewall parameters. You can also configure what services start up, as you know, when the machine starts up, and there's a lot of other configuration options that go on with rc.conf. So those are just a few of the relevant configuration files out there that have to do with security, and there are others as well, and some of them depend upon the different flavor of Unix that you're using or Linux, and some of them depend upon the service that you're using. Even each individual service, such as SendMail and NFS, also have their own configuration files that have security aspects to them as well that you can configure. Some of the important security measures that we have to take when implementing network security, there's a lot of them, but some of the few important ones I've listed here on the screen. For example, limit services that you run. You don't need everything running on a box. If you don't use NFS, don't enable NFS. If this server is only used as a DNS server, then that's the only thing that should be running on it. You shouldn't have a lot of other services simply because that opens your attack vector up to malicious users. You would only allow those services and accesses in inetd.conf. Only the ones that you need. The ones that you don't need, take them out. You should also limit the hosts that are listed in the etc host.allow file. What you don't want to do is open this up to every host out there on the network or the internet. Only the hosts that you know need access to these services should be listed in there. And one of the things I'll tell you not to do is don't use unsecure protocols. And when we say unsecure protocols, we're basically talking protocols such as Telnet, FTP, and the R services, RLogin, RCP, and so forth. These are unsecure protocols, and in some cases provide little or no authentication across the network, so anyone could log in using these services, and in some cases, or all cases, they don't encrypt the traffic that's sent, so this traffic could be intercepted by someone with a sniffer or something on the network. So you should avoid using those whenever possible. Now, another important thing I'll tell you, and we'll talk about a little bit more about it in another session, is securely configuring and using SSH. SSH pretty much takes the place of those unsecure protocols we just talked about, so we definitely want to use SSH and configure it properly instead of using those unsecure protocols. And again, we're going to talk about a lot of this stuff over the next few sessions that we've just touched on here briefly, and you'll see a little bit more in depth about how to configure some of these network security measures.